Okay, guys, now that we've wrapped up that whole living things are made of cells, living things grow and reproduce, those two criteria, we're going to start taking a look at the third criteria for something to be living, which is living things use energy. So, where do we get our energy? Well, as we talked about with McKenna, we have to eat to get our energy. Our nutrients are used to create energy in our cells. So, we're going to take a look at who eats who in the wild. We're going to look at some food chains. And so it says the food chain describes who eats whom in the wild. Every living thing, from one celled algae to giant blue whales, need food to survive. Each food chain is a possible pathway that energy and nutrients can follow through the ecosystem. For example, grass produces its own food from sunlight. A rabbit eats the grass, then a fox eats the rabbit. When the fox dies, bacteria break down its body and return it to the soil, where it provides nutrients for plants like grass. So we call them a chain because it looks like a chain, one right after the other. But really and truly, it's almost like a cycle. Of course, many different animals eat grass, and rabbits can eat other plants besides grass. Foxes, in turn, can eat many types of animals and plants. Each of these living things can be part of multiple food chains. All of the interconnected and overlapping food chains in an ecosystem make up a food web. So it's kind of like you guys don't eat the same thing every day. You don't eat chicken nuggets for every meal. Neither does anything else in nature. Your grasshopper is not always munching on this specific leaf, or this little mouse is not only eating grasshoppers, they eat a variety of different things. So, because of that, we have these lovely things that we call trophic levels. Organisms in food chains are grouped into categories called trophic levels. Roughly speaking, these levels are divided into producers, which is our first trophic level, consumers, which is the second, third, and fourth trophic level, and decomposers. Producers, also known as autotrophs, can make their own food. This is not going home and making some ramen noodles in the microwave. This is standing in the sun and carrying out photosynthesis. These producers make up the first level of every food chain. Autotrophs are usually plants or one celled organisms. Nearly all autotrophs use a process called photosynthesis, that's this big word right here, to create food or a nutrient called glucose, which we've heard a lot about, from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. Plants are the most familiar type of autotroph, but there are many other kinds. You've got algae, whose larger forms are known as seaweed. Those are autotrophic. Phytoplankton, little tiny organisms that live in the ocean, are also autotrophs. Some types of bacteria are autotrophs. For example, there are bacteria living in active volcanoes that use sulfur compounds to produce their own food. Now, since they're not using sunlight, this one is actually called chemosynthesis because they're using a chemical from these sulfur compounds instead of the light from the sun. So, this thing right here is an energy pyramid, and I know it sounds really weird, but this shows where our energy for every living thing on this planet comes from, and that's the sun. These producers use that sunlight to create glucose. Now, we'll come back and talk about the rest of these in a second. The second trophic level consists of organisms that eat the producers. These are called primary consumers or herbivores. So here are primary consumers because they just eat plants. Deer, turtles, types of birds, small mammals, insects, all kinds of things are herbivores and eat those plants. Then we have these guys right here, the secondary consumers. They eat the herbivores. So you have your sun giving energy for the primary producers to make that glucose. The primary consumers eat these plants and use their glucose. Secondary consumers eat these primary consumers and turn the nutrients from their bodies into the glucose that they need for energy. Now, last but not least, up here at the top, this tertiary consumer, this big word right here, you can think of T for 3 because this is, you have primary 1, secondary, literally second, and tertiary 3 and above. Tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers. There may be more levels before a chain finally reaches its top predator, and we call those top predators apex predators. So they eat all these other consumers. So you can see here that our snake and our bird are secondary consumers because they'll eat the rabbits and the bees and the grasshoppers. But these hawks, on the other hand, will eat the snakes and the other birds. So they are considered that tertiary. And in this particular chain would also be considered the apex predators. Consumers can be carnivores, animals that eat other animals, or omnivores, animals that eat both plants and animals. Omnivores, like people, consume many types of foods. People eat plants such as vegetables and fruits. We eat animal products such as meat, milk, and eggs. We eat fungi such as mushrooms and yeast. We also eat algae and edible seaweeds like nori, which is what they use to wrap sushi with, and sea lettuce, which they sometimes use in salad. Now comes the kind of sort of gross part, not gonna lie. Detritivores and decomposers are the final part of food chains. Detritivores eat poo sometimes, or decomposers will feed off of poo. Detritivores are organisms that eat non-living plant and animal remains. For example, scavengers such as vultures eat dead animals. Dung beetles eat animal feces, which is the big word for poop. Decomposers like fungi and bacteria complete the food chain. They turn organic waste, such as decaying plants, into organic materials, such as nutrient-rich soil. So this is why it's good sometimes to put waste and if you do a compost bin, if your family does compost, it's decomposing. These fungi and bacteria are in there and they're breaking down that stuff, and you can put it on your gardens and they'll grow really well because it puts all that nutrients back into the soil for the plants to use. Decomposers complete the cycle of life, returning nutrients to the soil or oceans for use by autotrophs. This starts a whole new food chain. So a food chain is literally just different habitats and ecosystems have different ones, of course, because they have different animals. So it's literally just like a list of who eats whom or what eats what, if you will. So in one marine food chain, a single-celled organism called phytoplankton provide food for tiny shrimp called krill. Now remember, this phytoplankton is one of those things that we said is a producer. It's using the sunlight. It's this little guy right here. It's using the sunlight and the water and CO2 to make glucose. So then the krill eats the phytoplankton, and krill provide the main food source for the blue whale, biggest animal on the planet, right? One of them anyway, which is an animal on the third trophic level. So it is a secondary consumer. Our krill would be our primary consumer because it ate the producer. The whale ate the krill, so it's going to be our secondary consumer. In a grassland, one that we might be a little bit more familiar with because we've heard of these things, a grasshopper might eat grass, a producer. So the grass makes its own food, but the grasshopper eats the grass. Then that grasshopper might get eaten by a rat, which in turn is consumed by a snake. Finally, a hawk, an apex predator, swoops down and snatches up the snake. So your grass is your producer. Since your grasshopper eats the grass, he's the primary consumer. Then that rat eats the grasshopper, he becomes our secondary consumer. And when the snake consumes the rat, he becomes our tertiary consumer. And then we've got this guy, the hawk, at the top of that food chain, an apex predator, because there aren't very many things that naturally prey on hawks. Swoops down and grabs up that snake and eats it. In a pond, your autotroph or your producer might be algae, just like the kind you get in swimming pools when you don't clean them, right? A mosquito larvae will eat that algae, and then a dragonfly larvae could eat the young mosquito. So we have algae as our producer, mosquito larvae is our primary consumer, dragonfly larvae is our secondary. But the dragonfly larvae then becomes food for a fish, which would be a tertiary consumer. And then it gets eaten by a raccoon, which we can't really call an apex predator because there's lots of things that eat raccoons, okay? Like even people probably, but whatever. So this one would actually also be known as a tertiary consumer. So once you finish this, you're going to go to Google Classroom and you're going to do your Google form for this particular article. Feel free to refer back. You have it in print on your tables, and I will see you guys tomorrow.